Hey everybody, welcome to Real Crime Profile. It's Lisa Z here with our dynamic duo crime brilliant people, Jim Clementi and Laura Richards. And I asked them to jump on with me because of the news that's been going on in the past few days about an abduction that happened in upstate New York of a 9-year-old girl. We are actually not going to say her name because her parents have asked that she get back to her normal life as quickly as possible, especially since she's been found safe. But I wanted to ask you all about this case that broke over the weekend on I believe it was Saturday, September 30th. She went missing around 6:45 p.m. Her family was camping at a campground in upstate New York, and she went missing. And then people very quickly mobilized and got involved, and thankfully she was found safe
Right.
on Monday evening. But I wanted to know what was going through all of your heads, as we know what a critical time it is when a child is reported missing.
Yeah, and before we get into that, this is a case where I do want to name the suspect because I do believe that the police need to know if this guy has been involved harassing or stalking or doing anything else around kids before, because he's 47 years old, and that's very late in life to start this kind of behavior. So I do think it's important that everybody knows his name is Craig Ross Jr., and he was living in a trailer apparently behind his mother's double wide trailer. So that's something that we can get into where and all that in a minute. We'll post that information. But certainly when it happened, when I learned of the circumstances, and a friend of mine who lives in New York sent me the Amber Alert as soon as it came out, and he said something interesting to me. He said, "Why would they wait 16 hours for an Amber Alert?" And I believe that is because they thought she was just lost. And apparently, the parents found her bicycle on this loop, this riding loop. She had been riding with her friends. She said, "I want to do one more loop," went off on her own and never came back. And so they did an intensive search of the area. And what we know is that they found the bicycle, they were searching the lake, they were doing searches in the woods. It's a very overgrown area, so it's very rural. So that makes sense. And that's the first thing you should do. You search concentric circles around the area where she was last seen,
Right,
and
because
you determine
you don't know if
the
it's an
window of opportunity.
animal, you don't know if she fell and then wandered off, you're not quite sure what's going on, and you're with all these
Exactly.
families that this area, it was not that far away from where she lived, so
Right.
it's a familiar area, and they may not immediately think that there's some stranger in the woods watching and waiting for an
Right.
opportunity.
So, my initial thoughts were, if this is an abduction, that this had to be an impulsive act, which usually means one of two things. Either it's a young offender, in his 20s or 30s, or it's an older offender who's extremely impulsive. And so that would come out in his life, in his work, in his relationships. He will do things in his life that are very impulsive. He's not thinking and planning things out and taking a lot of time to 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 pull off things like this. And this then, it turns out, morphed into a different kind of case. This was turned into a kidnapping case. Now, many people think any child abduction is a kidnapping, but actually a kidnapping occurs when there's a demand for ransom. And that happened in this case, although the police did not publicize it. And so about an entire day, more than 24 hours after she went missing, at about, I think, 4 in the morning, very early in the morning, it might have been 2 in the morning, sorry. But anyway, this guy drove to the parents' house where this girl lived and put a ransom note in their mail slot. And now, apparently he was not followed from that point, but they determined that it was a ransom note later, and they pulled fingerprints from it, and it did lead to him and to rescue the child, which is awesome. But this note, the fact that he hand delivered this note in his own car to the parents' address, that tells me, right, Laura, the criminal sophistication level here is very low. This is not somebody who thought this out for many weeks, months, or years and decided to act on it. This is somebody who acted very impulsively, didn't know what he should do or how he should do it. And I think he thought, well, I can't call them because they'll trace my phone, so I'll just go there and drop this letter off. But of course, he didn't use gloves when he handled the letter, and he left his fingerprints on it, and he was identified from a DUI case a number of years earlier, I think in '98. So those kinds of behavioral clues tell us about this guy. He's a disorganized offender. He's somebody who sort of, I think, likely happened upon this, saw the girls riding around, was there, and was definitely interested in taking advantage of the opportunity when he then saw her riding around on her own. He's a big guy, and I'm sure he was very intimidating. I don't know if he used a weapon or if it was just his size and his appearance, and he scared her, but he took her and left, and apparently went straight to the mother's home with his RV. Now, I don't know if he was in the park with that RV and he traveled and got her out of the park with that RV, or whether he brought her in another vehicle. I'm not sure what the deal is there, but as these details come out, I think we'll be able to come up with more information about him and who he is as an offender.
But Laura, don't you think that it might be a case of stalking? The fact that he lived about a mile away from this family and just happens to be camping in the same place?
I think it's most likely that she was targeted. But I do agree with Jim that he didn't think through every aspect of what he was going to do and how he was going to do it. And I did track this case from the start, and I was pushing out her picture on social media because I was extremely concerned, as were many people, about the circumstances of her going missing. And, it seemed that the family were searching for her, but it was when they found her bike, they realized that something wasn't quite right and they called the police. But I think in terms of ramping up the investigation, that all happened relatively quickly, and locking down the park. But I was very concerned, and I did write, had she been targeted? And I think the proximity of, he had moved out of his house into his mother's house, and how did he know where the 9-year-old's family lived to post the letter in the mailbox? It seemed to me that the family, and she may well have been targeted specifically. And so stalking it's not always about someone putting surveillance on another individual for days and months and years. It can be that they're just watching throughout that day. Mm-hmm. And, we don't know the ultimate motive. As you know, Jim, it might look like a kidnapping, but is it something else? And I was slightly concerned about when people were saying, thank goodness she's been recovered safe and healthy, because we don't know what transpired in that time. And God forbid, it's extremely traumatizing for her to be abducted, whether there's a weapon or not, him tying her up, putting her in a cabinet, I believe, and her being ripped away from her family for a period of time. That's terrifying for a little girl. And so the psychological trauma, I would imagine, will be severe. We don't know whether there was any sexual motivation. Certainly in the media, they're making noises that it's much more about finances, that it was money that he was after, that he had moved out of his house because he had fallen behind with payments, and that's why he was in this trailer at his mother's house. I don't know whether that's true or not, and certainly the way that it's been framed is that this could be a financial motive, that he was after money, and we don't know what was in that note. But it's a very elaborate way, and a very traumatizing way to get money, and a very high risk way.
Yes.
And why choose a 9-year-old girl rather than anybody else? Was this a family with money? And I can't talk to that, but as we always know, victimology is really important as to, was she a high value target? And I don't believe that she was. So, what did he demand in terms of the money? Was it a certain amount because he was behind with payments on his house? Was it a unrealistic amount? But it was certainly a very unsophisticated way of carrying out a crime, of going to the home address where, of course, it was most likely, well, going to be police and law enforcement there with the family, doing a family liaison role and carrying out their investigation. But thank goodness she was recovered. And that part I felt elated about, as I know many other people did. But that doesn't mean to say it's over for her or for her family.
No, exactly. I mean, she was only gone for maybe 2 days, but to a parent, that's an eternity. And if every minute you don't know where your child is, and is a nightmare, and torture. But I'm just so stunned that if he hadn't done this ransom note thing, he could have been to the Canadian border already. I mean, he got out of the
Absolutely.
periphery. I mean, it's only, let's just place this. This is in upstate New York near Saratoga Springs and Skidmore College, which I've spent some time at. You're closer to Vermont than you are to Manhattan in this particular period. You're only 2 hours away from the Canadian border. There's the Highway 87 is right there. He could have been long gone. And that's just so terrifying that he was able to get out of the area so quickly.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, in any child abduction case, that is the biggest risk factor. That if the person is mobile, if they are able to transport the child to another location, that is a very, very extremely risky thing. And it increases the chances that something really bad will happen to that child. They always, if they're moving a child from one place to another, they always take them to a place where they have more privacy and control. And when they have more privacy and control, they can do worse things. So it's really important. I mean, we always say this, it's that if somebody tries to take you, whether you're a child or an adult, to another location, your chances of not surviving that are increased dramatically. And fighting for your life there is much more viable than fighting for your life in a place where they have more control.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'll add is that the family really did appeal to whoever had taken her. And I wonder whether he heard that appeal and therefore the ransom side, the letter came thereafter. And that was sort of a way out of, realizing how bad the situation was. And the search ultimately was so intensive that he would most likely be found. And I just wonder on that timeline and whether it was sexually motivated. And I can't put that out of my head, because we know most often, unless you're going after a high value target, that the family, etc., have a lot of money, and therefore it is purely about the financial motivation. This just does not feel like that to me. I don't know about what you think, Jim, but I think the media now are really positioning it like that. And there's stories of he has multiple sclerosis and he has problems moving. Well, he certainly didn't have problems moving a 9-year-old off of her bike and squirreling her away in his trailer, tying her up in a cabinet. So, that's questionable for me. And I just don't like this kind of way the media are moving about colouring in the picture of him, because to me, he just looks like a damn creepy guy, quite frankly. He is the guy who looks like your worst nightmare.
Right. Absolutely. And so, yeah, the fact that he does hit the place he was staying was within a mile of where the victim's family was. That's a pretty interesting fact. The fact that this park was 20 minutes away. I don't know if the family had planned this trip or this was just a sort of a weekend getaway that they just did on the spur of the moment. I have no idea. I have no idea how he would have known that, whether he followed them or whether he just happened to be going to that park on a regular basis to look for opportunities like this. I just don't know. These are things that I would certainly pursue. There's a log of when people come into this park, with a vehicle. So maybe they'll find that he does this often, or maybe they'll find that this is the first time he ever did this. But he certainly was in the log, and he left that park probably immediately after he took her and before any alarm was raised, because I'm sure it was minutes when the parents started thinking, and then that, where is she? And then finding out from her friends that she went off on her own, and then walking that path and finding her bike, that turns into, 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes before they even are aware. And he, by that time, is already back at his place. So that's a very typical timeline. That's why these cases are so dangerous, because things happen incredibly fast, and sometimes they happen before the child is even discovered missing. So to have her recovered 48 hours later, alive, is a wonderful thing, because the stats are pretty grim, of kids who are abducted and killed. Most of them, 44%, happen within 1 hour, 73% within 3 hours, and 99% within 24 hours. So the fact that she was not killed probably means that he did not intend to do that. He did not intend to kill her. But about 2/3 of the non-familial long-term abductions end up in that tragic way, and that it's just so, I'm just so glad. I mean, a third of them don't. A third of the children are returned, and that's a wonderful thing. And I'm just so glad that she was among those lucky victims. It's
Absolutely.
just terrible to
too.
know what the family has gone through and what she has gone through. But, luckily she's around, and she can, she's with her family, and she can hopefully address those issues, any trauma that she suffered.
But I think that point, Jim, is a really important one about his history, because as we know, offenders aren't always convicted of the things that they do. People don't always report the near misses of what's gone on. And we know that through all the cases that we've worked. So I'm just imploring people, if you have come across this individual before, if he's taken photos or you felt uncomfortable or near your child, please do report it to law enforcement so that they can properly understand the timeline and his offending behavior, rather than it just looking like he's done this one thing. Because I just want to share with you also, just to further reinforce that, from looking at an article that CBS have just published, there's somebody who has made a report about him in particular, saying, and I just want to share with you what was reported on. My family had an issue with him in the beginning of the summer, Brown said. Brown said she came outside one day as her young grandson was in the yard, and standing over him, right over him, with his back to me, was that man, Brown said. You confronted him. He got on his bike and rode away, CBS New York's Tony Aiello asked. Yes, and I believe with all my heart after last night that probably my grandson was this close, Brown said.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I expected. Exactly. And, this is the kind of thing where that's relatively recently, apparently. And I think that we could go back a number of years and see other kinds of behaviors leading up to this kind of behavior.
That's why I just don't buy the ransom note part. It just doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel right, unless they are a family with, a lot of money and they stand out, i.e. an amount's going to be put to them specifically that they can afford. Then why take her? Why be targeting a 9-year-old rather than someone where you can get more money? It just seems to me that came afterwards as a thought of trying to get out of this situation. And I would imagine, just like this young grandson, there will be many more of those type situations where people feel, oh, thank goodness something bad was about to happen, but they didn't call it in because it didn't happen, and they know how busy the police are and so on. But given that he is 6'4", given if you Google him, you see someone who's quite distinctive in terms of the way he looks, please do have a look at him. And if you have any experience or any form of encounter with this individual, please do call it into the police.
When we post this video, I'll definitely post a picture of him, which of course we hardly ever do that, as we don't want to focus on the offender, but this is a very different situation. And we are not saying the victim's name because we want her to get the help she needs and to go back into her normal life as quickly as possible. Well,
No.
Thank you both, Jim and Laura, for
right.
jumping on to talk about this case, and all of our hearts go out to the family and this victim. So for now, this is Real Crime Profile signing off.